welcome. We're very excited to have you. My name is Maddie Duke, and on behalf of ABA Technologies, I want to thank you for being here today. At ABA Technologies, we help small and medium companies who have specific performance problems by making sure that employees know what to do and by making sure they do it. In the context of today's webinar, we are specifically talking about RBT professional development. A little bit about our presenter. Adam Hochman is the Senior Vice President of Learning Partnerships and Growth at ABA Technologies. As one of our instructional designers, Adam focuses on integrating innovative and educational technologies and instructional design methods into our expanding range of products. Adam plays a pivotal role in building learning and performance systems, as well as corporate training programs that enhance professional capabilities. His background includes valuable work developing educational technologies in private school settings and for pediatric cancer patients. And a special thank you to Danielle Lafrance, who will be helping with an activity a little bit later. So without any further delay, let's begin.
All right. Thanks, Maddie, and welcome everybody. We're excited to have you here at our November clinical webinar. Continuing this trip down, making sure that you're ready for the 2026 RBT changes. And we're specifically talking about professional development. And today is sort of a intro and an extension of our last webinar that was about professional development, which is that continuing education requirement from the BACB once someone obtains their 40-hour training and their credential. And over the next several months, Danielle and I are going to be presenting a series of webinars that are about the professional development component. And we're going to specifically dive into different topic areas. So we're going to talk about things like professionalism, error correction, prompting, skill acquisition, discrete trial procedures. What do you do to develop ongoing opportunities for technicians to learn, relearn, establish, strengthen those skills that they're going to need to make the most difference with clients. So this is sort of about some of the background related to those items, and then we'll get into content areas over the next several months, featuring one of our newer products called ProTech. If this is your first time with us, we have been trying to do every month or every other month a clinical webinar focused on these upcoming changes and other topics, and we're continuing to do them into 2026 with the addition of some other really cool clinical topics, which I'm excited about. But if you want to take a look at all of our previous webinars, they're on our YouTube page under ABA Technologies. If you'd like to see the longer version, I'm going to recap some of the things from the last webinar. If you want to see the longer version of that, that's already on the YouTube channel. We also are kicking off at the end of this year into next year, the clinical leaders community. This is going to be a professional learning space where if you're a clinical director, training director, chief clinical officer, a trainer, you don't even have to be a behavior analyst, but a trainer, someone who is responsible or has oversight over training, supervision, performance systems. This is a community that will have other like-minded people in it. You'll have access to us at ABA Technologies, where this is what we do all day long. And we will have a variety of offerings, webinars, journal clubs, workshops, roundtables. We're going to have guest speakers, some exclusive resources, those types of things. In the chat, Maddie's going to drop in a link. If you'd like us to notify you about the clinical community, and we're also just trying to gauge interest about what you want in the community, please fill that out so that we can get in contact with you when that goes live. The other thing that we've been offering over the last several months is the opportunity to meet with us, to have a free 30-minute learning consult. This could be about a range of topics. We've met with people who are just starting a clinic, all the way to larger companies that are looking to make the transition to 2026 or want to talk about a particular compliance risk related to their training program. And Maddie will also include that link to schedule. You can just find a Calendly time that works, and we're happy to talk about whatever you'd like to discuss. We also, over the last couple of months, have partnered with Michael Fabrizio and Rose Fedek at ABA Compliance Solutions, and they launched the ABA Compliance podcast. There are now 3 episodes out. The first intro episode that we did was just overviewing them as professionals and what their company does, as well as what they're going to achieve with the podcast. They have since recorded and published two episodes. One's on reading the fine print of third-party funder contracts, and the second one is on documenting your compliance decisions. I have listened to the episodes, and I think they're really useful, especially if you're in a situation where you don't have a compliance director or compliance coordinator, and you have oversight over aspects related to funding or other types of regulatory compliance. So I encourage you to check that out. You can find that by searching ABA Compliance Podcast anywhere that you get your podcasts. So let's recap some of the things related to the professional development requirement for 2026. First, the major change in starting in January, which is just right around the corner, is the changes to the 40-hour training and the addition of this 12 credit hour per certification cycle, where RBTs, just like BCBAs, have to get ongoing continuing education. And there are certain activities that count toward professional development and some of them that do not. A lot of you probably work in organizations where you have ongoing professional in-service kinds of events that would already count for this requirement. This is a document from July of this year where the BACB outlines what counts, what doesn't count. They give examples of what needs to be in the makeup of those activities, like using behavior skills training, using active student responding, those types of things, as well as how you track those requirements. And they also provided some additional guidelines in August on what to do in this transition period, like when you have people who are onboarding at the end of this year, how to get them ready for next year. So I encourage you to take a look at these two documents along with all the other ones that the BAC's put out, so that you can get oriented to it. But one of the things we emphasized in our last webinar was that even though it's very easy to check the continuing ed box for technicians, I mean, it really 12 credits over 2 years, okay, it is really nothing for a lot of places. It's an opportunity where some companies will take the easy route to just get those requirements, provide those events, give them the certificates so that they can recertify. But the better alternative approach is to really make sure that what you're offering in the way of professional development is aligned with a lot of the core needs of the technicians who are working in your company. And so a one size fits all, if you've got multiple centers, providing the same professional development experience to one center may not be appropriate because they may have more tenured staff than you have at some other centers. So we've tried to start talking about in these webinars, really tailoring those to ensure that they are meeting the needs of technicians that are going to move on in your organization and move up in a career ladder. And the professional development requirement is now one of the first steps towards saying we need to create professional pathways for technicians so that they want to stay in their role. And that's one of the ways that you can do that. So what I'm going to do next is recap some of the big ideas that we talked about from our last webinar, where we introduced the professional development requirement. So we talked about what do you need in place? What are some of the big things you need in place when you develop a professional development program for technicians? Well, the first one is you need to make sure you have a tracking system, and the BACB provides guidelines on how to track to make sure that you can verify that people that are participated in the entire event. And this seems pretty easy, although I will say that when we've gone and done on-site observations with our clients, it's actually trickier than some people may think, because you might be having a CE event at a team meeting and then somebody gets a walkie call and has to run out of the event and they didn't sign out of the event. So that didn't count toward their credits, and they don't remember that they didn't sign out. So then they think they're a little bit further ahead with the number of credits they need than they actually are. So you need to make sure that you have a system of tracking that and making sure that while people are in the event, that they are actively participating. The second one is understand what people want and need. You don't want to just provide a bunch of topics that check the box, but are things that people don't need additional practice on, are already contacting in the natural environment with their clients, or are getting quite a bit of supervision on. Target the things that people are maybe not getting in those supervision meetings or on the job kind of coaching episodes, the things that need some upfront training and then ongoing support. The third big idea is to really tailor those PD events. What an RBT1 needs is different from someone who's in an RBT or a lead RBT role. And one of the big things we hear is that RBTs that move up in their professional journey do not have access to things like leadership training, provided with coaching skills, giving and receiving feedback, those kinds of things that will help them lead their teams. Fourth big idea is to balance PD opportunities. Don't try to stack all of your clinical topics, the ones that count toward PD, at the beginning or the end of the year or something like that, but rather space them out. We know that certain, if you have a monthly team meeting, maybe not every month will you be able to count it toward a CE, but be planful across the arc of the year so that those topics are distributed and you can do review from one month to the next month rather than wait to all the way to the end to get people their continuing ed credits or stacking all the clinical topics at the beginning of the year saying, we got 6 in this year. Now we can talk about operational things for the rest of the year. So really make sure that you balance out those opportunities and balance them in a way that people can take what they've learned in the PD event and apply it on the job, and then create a journey that makes sense. It's one of the things that is a little trickier with the PD requirement for RBTs is that you're going to have people coming and going. And I mean, the reality of turnover in organizations right now is that you will have a lot of coming and going of new RBTs. And so what you want to do is try to make sure that there are some different entry points so that someone that has been there since January gets sort of this continuation, this journey of experiences over the year. And somebody that enters in March or enters in June isn't completely confused by the continuing ed events that you're providing. So think about having different entry points throughout the year, and that will ensure that both the people who are there are not going to be repeating topics often and are going to get, are going to feel a progression themselves. So then we also looked at the elements of the PDU, the actual unit that you provide the experience. And this is just one visual kind of conceptualization of that. You start with a professional development unit or event. Okay, let's say it's 30 minutes or it's an hour event. And then you follow up on it. And this is the big gap that we see in behavior analyst training or CEs is we will have this great CE event. We might even bring a guest speaker in for a forum, and then there's absolutely no follow-up from it. Okay, everybody's engaged and excited about it during the event, but after that, nothing happens and nobody checks whether any of the things that were taught in that training were ever implemented, practiced, refined, and so forth. So when you present a training, let's say you are, presenting a professional development event on looking for and responding to indicating responses. Okay. Make sure that the vocabulary of that session, the ideas, the techniques, the maybe checklists that you provide, any of the resources, that those are followed up on in things like your morning meeting. Talk about, do shout outs with people identifying, indicating responses they observed on the previous day or ways that they've responded to those and prompted a mand. Make sure that it comes up in supervision, that if you're designing professional development experiences for the tech level, you have to make sure your supervisors are in on it. Okay, because they have to be able to support the implementation of it and the reinforcement of it. And then make sure that you think about whether or not what you started needs a follow-up kind of event. And then think about what events do we select and are we going to implement that can actually be applied to cases that people are working on? If we're going to do let's say we're just going to do a PD event that's on potty training, and none of the clients in the center are working on potty training goals, then is that a relevant kind of PDU that they're going to be able to readily apply in the next month, let's say? What are the things, if we look across this pod of 10 learners, or if we look across the entire clinic, what are the couple of big skill gaps? What are the couple of big topics that we could address that people are asking for? And they could easily find opportunities on the case to apply that and then come back to supervision, come back to those coaching events and reinforce that. And then finally, what are the ways we can extend it? Can we start with a topic that then gets extended and built on in subsequent months and subsequent PDUs and on-the-job experiences? So when we think about that kind of framework, if you're the designer of training at your company, that's one of the things that you should really consider. And it's one of the things that you want to ask the people who are going to both encounter the PDU and the people who are supervising those who are encountering those PD events. Then we also reviewed in our last webinar some of the ingredients of that experience, making sure that there's scaffolded instruction and practice, that practice is distributed, it's not just isolated into one event. It's not just massed into one event, but there are practice opportunities and review opportunities across time, that there's time for that on the job application, that you've linked to supervision coaching and you have debriefs to go over how it went and what we need to do to improve. And then making sure that you've got a healthy dose of recognition and rewards in there so that people are seeing it, they're hearing it, it becomes part of the fabric of the company, and then you've got those continued practice and extensions. So that kind of recaps what we talked about with the professional development event. In that early upfront event, that's the time where we want good practices like concept instruction. We want behavior skills training. We want opportunities to see high quality models, to ask questions, to have discussion, those kinds of things. We want to see those early upfront in those events. And what we're going to now talk about is what happens after that event ends. What happens on the other end of that? What are some of the strategies you can use? And we're going to talk about 3 big strategies today that you can use to increase active, meaningful participation. Do that in a way that reinforces what you started in that initial event. And what I'm going to do first is kind of center us around this model that comes from Doug Greer and colleagues. And there will be an article, there's the 1991 article, there are other resources about this model in that resource list. So Greer and colleagues said, okay, we're training behavior analysts. They're going to be what we call strategic scientists. And strategic scientists do a lot of things, and it requires different skills that are part of different repertoires. And they outlined 3 repertoires that interlock with one another. There's a lot of overlap in having them. And when one of these is not well established, then you don't really have the robust strategic scientist kind of repertoire established. So they talked about 3 of them: contingency shaped. And these are the behaviors or practices that somebody implements when they are actually facilitating a treatment session, let's say. For behavior analysts, it's things like designing objectives. For a technician, it might be implementing naturalistic teaching procedures. It could be graphing data on a line graph. These are the behaviors that are shaped by directly contacting reinforcement of doing the work itself, like interacting with a client. The client, the other concept that comes from Greer and colleagues, is the learn unit. That my behavior is going to have an effect on your behavior as the learner, and your behavior is going to have an effect on my behavior as the instructor. They're interlocking with one another. They don't happen separately. So contingency shaped is where we spend often a lot of time with technicians. We teach them how to do the thing, how to implement the discrete trial, how to use the prompt. Verbal behavior about the science is having verbal behavior, being able to talk about what you're doing and why you're doing it. So being able to label that this is a manned and this is attacked, and to be able to tell me, why is this attacked? What are the controlling variables in this example? All right. Being able to use the vocabulary of the science, which then, of course, impacts how you implement the procedure and how well receptive you are in supervision interactions or problem solving, which takes us to the verbally mediated repertoire. And that's the accumulation of contingency shaped and verbal behavior about the science. And this is really like problem solving, like noticing that when you've plotted something on a graph, you've conducted visual inspection, and you realize the intervention isn't working, and you start to think about why it's not working. And so you apply a bunch of different tactics, and you start talking using your verbal behavior about the science. You start talking about it, identifying some of the barriers, and then identifying what you're going to do instead. And so a strategic scientist is someone that can use behavior principles across a range of settings, and in our case, in a therapeutic setting. And they're able to apply principles like continuous measurement, database decision-making, experimental designs to ensure that every learner that comes through the door is learning and making progress toward socially meaningful goals. Now, this model developed around the behavior analyst role, but it applies to the technician role. They may not need the same level of verbal behavior about the science or verbally mediated behavior because they're engaged in different activities in their role. But the idea still stands. This is a good way to categorize the kinds of professional development and training experiences you provide for people. Because if all you ever have people do is look at a protocol and follow the task analysis to implement the protocol, they may not have these other repertoires established. And that's when you see a lot of gaps in procedural fidelity. People, supervisors will say, they ask me a question about everything, even things they know how to do. Okay. And then when you go and talk to them, you realize that a lot of these repertoires have a lot of gaps. They have a lot of splinter skills within the repertoires. So this is a helpful framework when you're designing training to be thinking through this and thinking about what's relevant within each of these buckets in this moment, in this interaction with this client, with this technician working with this client. So if we go back to our framework, the three kind of tactics or strategies we're going to look at that will help us shape up and strengthen those three repertoires and can be the kinds of activities we use after the professional development and event ends. Today, we're going to talk about talk aloud problem solving. That is a procedure. We're going to talk about a procedure called teach back, and then we're going to talk about debriefing. Okay. And for all three of these, we'll have some additional references that you can kind of explore them more deeply. So let's talk about talk aloud problem solving. Talk aloud problem solving, or TAPS, is a method that was described by initially Arthur Wimby and Jack Lockhead, and it was used with adult learners. And what they would do is they'd pair learners together to think aloud to develop their analytical reasoning and problem solving. The idea that when we hand, when they did this in law schools or med schools, when we hand someone a problem like a case, and we ask them to work through it, build logic around whatever the case is, be able to answer certain questions, solve problems. A lot of that was happening covertly. And because it was happening covertly, the instructors weren't able to observe it and shape it and look for breakdowns in thinking and problem solving. And so TAPS became a way for people to partner students together, have them think aloud as they're engaged in whatever that activity is. And then as they're in that activity, the instructor can shape that. Dr. Joanne Robbins, who's the emeritus principal at Morningside Academy in Seattle, adapted that approach from Wimby for the classroom in a K-12 setting. And so what she and her colleagues did is they used the same approach where they would establish two separate repertoires, the problem solver and the active listener. And they would have students play those two roles in problem solving events while the problem solver would solve the problem aloud. And we're going to watch a video of this. And then the active listener would be there to follow along with them. And they would engage in a variety of behaviors to encourage them, correct their thinking, reinforce their thinking, those kinds of things. And what it does at the classroom level is it creates a shared vocabulary around thinking and an explicit process for doing that. And as a result, it developed fluent thinking skills. So in this video that comes from Joanne's website, and she sells the full curriculum, which is for K through 12 schools, this is an example of two learners who are engaged in a TAPS scenario. They are, the girl with the blonde hair is the problem solver, and the boy is playing the role of the active listener. And they're both looking at a logic puzzle. And what you're going to notice is that the girl's going to be thinking aloud throughout the entire situation. And the active listener is going to reinforce, encourage, prompt as needed. And even though this is an example with children, what I'm going to do at the end is I'm going to ask you, where do you think this could be applied in your setting as a supervisor? And I have used this video and this exercise that we'll do in a minute with a couple of different behavior analyst groups. And I've been really surprised by different kind of novel ideas of where they could apply TAPS and where so far, they really haven't done that. They have been giving their technician demands and then giving them feedback when they don't follow through on those demands, or they have a conversation about something, they let them engage in the performance, and then they go and they provide correction later on. What you're going to notice in here is that because the problem solver is talking aloud, we can fix a lot of the missteps that could potentially occur while they're happening in the moment, rather than waiting for this entire chain to occur and then responding to it. All right, so here we go. Take a look. I want you to notice what are the things that the problem solver is doing and the things that the active listener is doing.
Okay, so this one's called Collars, Colors, and Sports. 4 cats named Bob, Barb, and Billy and Beulah each wore a collar of a different color. Their collars were tan, gold, peach, and maroon. Each of the cats had a different favorite sport that they enjoyed. Their favorite sports were baseball, football, swimming, and diving. Based on the clues, match the cats with their collars, colors, and their favorite sports. Okay, so here's the first clue. The number of letters in the colors is not the same for any cat as the number of letters in the names.
So
Okay.
is this helpful right now?
What do you mean?
Is this helpful for us right now, or should we move on to the next
Not
clue?
really. It's kind of confusing, actually. So, second one is Bob and Billy had favorite sports that needed water. Okay, so diving and swimming both need water. You can't really do that without any water. That just
So
doesn't really
what
work.
should we do for Bob and Billy?
So we should find Bob and Billy. Bob's here, Billy's here, and we should cross off
Land
football
sports.
and baseball, both of them.
Land sports.
Yes. So the cat in the peach.
Doesn't this also show us one other thing? About Barb and Billy?
What?
It shows us one more thing about Barb and Beulah, that we can cross out something.
Oh. With Barb and Beulah, we can cross off swimming and diving. Yep. Makes sense. Okay. So, number 3. The cat in the peach collar loved swimming. That's not helpful to us right now, but
Well,
if we
it could
use
be
that,
helpful. It could be helpful now. So we know one thing, it has to be one of the things that does swimming, wouldn't it? So we could cross it out for the land lovers.
okay, so then that means that we can cross off peach from Beulah and Barb. The cat, nope, never mind. The cat in the maroon collar loved baseball. Okay, so we know that the one that does baseball is either Beulah or Barb. So, we can remember that and we can use that later on.
Are you sure there's still one more thing we can't do?
Hold on. That means that Billy and Bob, we can cross off the maroon color. Okay, so now, Beulah's collar was not gold. Okay, so if we cross off gold, that means it's either tan or maroon. So, if the baseball-loving cat had a maroon collar, then there's a really good chance now that Beulah's collar is maroon. But
I'm going to pause the video there, but I think you got to see a lot of what the problem solver and active listener are doing in this kind of simulated problem. But what's interesting is if you're ever at Morningside where everybody, students are doing taps at every grade level, you'll hear them say, I need to taps this out. They know the benefit of playing the role of the problem solver and the active listener. I one time saw 2 kids taps out how they were going to convince their parents that they could have a sleepover. And so one of them played the problem solver and the other one played the active listener to think through where there were gaps in their logic around how they were going to get their parents to let them have that sleepover. So there's a lot that can happen. And if you read that article by Robbins, you'll learn more about the roles and specifically how this progresses across time. So based on watching that video in the chat, I just want you to share what are some of the things that you observed the problem solver or the active listener doing in that video. You can put PS for problem solver, AL for active listener. Good. So some of the things that the problem solver was doing is they, of course, were talking through step by step while the active listener was tracking along with them and calling out things like, did you notice anything else? Are you sure you aren't missing anything? Should we recheck our work? And actually, they, in the article, but when they implement TAPS, they have a scorecard. It has a category, a set of, I think, 5 behaviors for the problem solver, 5 behaviors for the active listener. And if a teacher is walking around and monitoring, they're putting tallies in those columns of what they observed. So they're seeing, the active listener helped them catch their mistakes. They reinforced or they encouraged them when they were getting to a difficult point. And over time of implementing TAPS, they're able to progress through a series of more difficult situations. So now I want you to think, where in your clinical practice, when you're providing, when you're supervising RBTs, or maybe you're in a situation where you've designed a professional development event, and now you want them to go and apply it, where could you implement TAPS as a way to strengthen whatever you taught in that event? This might even be something that you do during the actual training event itself. You provided a scenario. Something that comes to mind for me is that if you were training on some particular clinical procedure, having people find an opportunity where they could apply that with their own client, and then doing a TAPS around what would be the implications of using it with their client, given what they know. Talking through a new protocol, problem solving around an updated safety protocol, using it to review some situation that's happened, both something that went well as something that didn't go well. All right. So what we're going to do is Maddie, Danielle, and I are going to act out a situation for you where you could apply TAPS in a behavior analytics setting. And so here's just one example. This example is one where a client refuses to wear a bracelet that does location tracking, and it's used as an elopement prevention tool. And the caregivers have asked that the client practice wearing it in the clinic, especially during transitions and when they go out to the playground. And so the behavior analyst has written a protocol. She's trained on it. She's found that it isn't working. They're not following through, or some parts are getting implemented, but sometimes they aren't. And so there's a lot of inconsistency. So rather than retrain, because there's already been training and some retraining, she decides, okay, we're going to do a TAPS event. We're going to TAPS out this protocol, look at what's going on. I'm going to have the active listener actually come up with some scenarios. And in this case, the technician's a more senior technician, a Tech 2, and we'll see what we get on the other end of it. So we're having a little meeting about this client, and we begin our TAPS episode about this safety protocol. All right. So I'm going to play the role of the behavior analyst, and Danielle and Maddie are going to play the roles of the problem solver and the active listener. Okay. All right. So the client is refusing to wear the bracelet, and the goal, of course, is that it prevents elopement during transition. So let's talk through this protocol. Danielle, I'd like you to be the active listener, and Maddie, if you'll be the problem solver here.
Okay. So for this protocol, first we tell the client the expectation. We state it very clearly. If he still refuses, I can offer a brief choice, like, do you want to wear it on your right or left wrist? If he escalates further, I call for support and block access to the exit.
Okay, good. So you're prioritizing transition safety goal and trying to choice opportunity before increasing your support. But what would you do if he dropped to the floor instead of walking?
I would block the exit, reinforce calm behavior, and wait for readiness before prompting again.
Earlier, you mentioned calling for support. What cues would tell you that you need another team member right away?
If the client moves past my blocking position into the unsafe zone, like within arm's reach of the exit, I'd call immediately.
Yes, you identified a clear safety threshold. Nice job tying your decision to objective markers you observed rather than just guessing.
What if the client throws a bracelet at you? Does that change your plan?
I would still block, but I'd wait until they're calm before representing. I wouldn't chase the bracelet if it rolled away. Safety first.
Good job prioritizing safety.
And what happens if another client is in the hallway and is getting affected by this behavior?
I would probably position my body so I'm between both clients and the exit, then call for assistance sooner than later.
You're right to consider the other clients. Let's refine one piece. Instead of splitting your attention, just call immediately because our supervision ratio is already pretty stretched. You want to prioritize the most imminent safety risk first.
How do you know when to reinforce during this?
I reinforce calm body and hands and walking with me as soon as I see it.
Good. That's solid. You're looking for signs that he's calm again and ready to walk. And we want to take that approach even if we can't get the bracelet on him. That's why collecting data is important, because if our current protocol doesn't work, we'll need to find another way. Okay, so let's summarize what we discussed.
Sure. So first, represent bracelet calmly, then offer a choice. 2, block elopement and call for support immediately if it feels unsafe or other clients are involved. 3rd, reinforce. And 4th, prioritize safety in the moment over wearing the bracelet.
Great summary. Thanks for thinking aloud. Thanks, Danielle. I appreciate you generating some realistic scenarios that might happen in practice. So in that scenario, in that even if it was only, a couple of minutes, by first calling this a talk aloud problem solving event, you solve some issues with people who don't you aren't always necessarily checking their understanding about what they're supposed to be doing. Okay, because you've both now brought it in, you've called it this thing, they know what it is, they know it's this type of event, how it looks, they know that it's going to involve usually another technician, and you're able to talk through it. So both you're working on shaping what the problem solver knows and does related to this protocol, but you're doing the same for the active listener. Because the active listener, especially if they're a tech 2 or they're a leader in the a lead tech of some sort, you're getting to really both make sure that they focus on the right kinds of questions they should be asking of technicians who are implementing a protocol. So it's really important that you think about it that way. In this case, I didn't really demonstrate it playing the role of the behavior analyst, that there are things that I might shape about what the active listener is doing. But in this situation, if they weren't asking the right questions, I might chime in with some questions, or I might get the active listener to think about what are the other kinds of things they should be asking to ensure that the problem solver, the tech 1 in this case, has what they need to know and be able to do to implement the protocol. Okay. So taps can be used in a variety of different ways. That was just one example, but it is a way, especially if you've got people who are very sensitive to kind of constructive feedback. It kind of changes the dynamic around it, provides some psychological safety around it, and encourages a productive dialogue. So taps is that first procedure. The next one we're going to talk about is teach back. And again, all 3 of these are ones that you can embed within a PD event, but I'm showing you them as things you could do after the PD event, things that really will help strengthen what you teach. So the next one's teach back. And this is a procedure that's often used in healthcare to increase communication either between a clinician and a patient or between clinicians. And so the basics of it are that the clinician explains some chunk of information and the patient or another clinician repeats it back in their own words, or they teach it back. Andressa Slayman and colleagues are some of the first, or maybe the first, that have applied this or published about it in a behavior analytics setting. And so they did a study where they used teach back with staff, or they used undergrads in this study. And what they had them do is they first read instructions about a skill that they were going to implement, like an MSWO or token economy. And then the participant would teach back what they learned to the experimenter from the instructions. And the experimenter would ask some probing questions about what they read. And the experimenter would then say, yes, that's correct, or here, that was not quite right. Let me adjust that a little bit. And then the participant would go and demonstrate the skill after they completed the teach back. And this method is one that requires very little or no planning. Like I said, it's one that's very common in healthcare research, where the clinician is presenting information, and we're going to watch a video of this, presenting information to a patient, and they're teaching it back, or they're recalling it back. and you continue the teach back process. If the patient or the clinician or whoever you're having do the teach back doesn't teach it back correctly, then you repeat the process. It's just like in behavioral skills training where you've got that iterative process of rehearsal and feedback. Okay, that same loop is happening. And what you realize as you do more teach backs is that maybe you aren't explaining it very well. Okay, and there might be a communication barrier just right up front. All right. And so in this study, what they found was that using teach back alone was able to establish or increase procedural fidelity between 88 and 91%, meaning that there was actually no direct practice component until they went and did it in the application check or the post-training probe. And then what they did is after teach back, they gave some additional feedback, and they were able to get with the addition of feedback, they were able to get all the participants up to 100% of implementing those procedures. What's great about this is that teach back is very efficient. In this study, I think the average was 12 minutes for that teach back episode. And that they compared that to studies on BST that have used BST to teach similar types of procedures that have taken between 80 and 115 minutes to conduct. So BST is a gold standard for a lot of us when we are in clinic and we're providing support to clinicians, but not always is it realistic given the time constraints. And because it's not always realistic means that sometimes people avoid using it altogether. So this, I thought this was a really, really clean, simple study that showed the effects of that and was able to compare it to other studies on BST. And since this Slayman study, other people have started to use teach back. I just did a workshop a couple of days ago, and I saw in the chat that someone was doing their dissertation on teach back. So hopefully it's starting to build its way in more into the behavior analytic and OBM literature. So that's just one application, is using it related to teaching different procedures. Another way to use it is sharing information with someone and having them teach it back. So this could be with caregivers, giving caregivers information about a protocol, or you teach back to the caregiver what they shared with you about a client. It could be with technicians about delivering information, giving them information about maybe a protocol that's happening at home that they should be aware of. What we're going to do is watch a short video of a clinician doing a teach back with a patient. The clinician's right here, patient's right here. So you're going to see kind of how easy she's able to flow this into the conversation.
Now here's your copy of the after visit summary that we just went over. Now I want to be sure that I did a good job explaining about asthma and your inhaler. What will you say to your family when you leave the clinic today?
Well, they know I had the appointment, so they're going to want to know how it went, and I'll just have to let them know. The doctor says I have asthma and that I need to start using an inhaler.
Yep, that's right. Can you tell me a little bit about asthma? You can start, and I can fill in some details.
Sure. From what I understand, my lungs get clogged, and it makes it hard for me to breathe sometimes. And one of the things I've been told to stay away from are smokers.
That's right. Let's take a look here at your after visit summary and then also this packet called Managing Your Asthma. And you're right. Asthma can cause the airways in your lungs to get inflamed and constricted, making it hard to breathe. But your inhaler will help things open up so you can breathe a little bit easier.
Okay.
And I'm glad you mentioned smoking. Staying away from smoking is the right thing to do, along with staying away from these other things listed here in your packet. These things are called triggers. And can you think of any other triggers that might be around you?
Yeah. One in particular, our neighbors, we do a lot with our neighbors, and they have 2 old English sheepdogs, and they're always with them. And when they come over to our house, those dogs always are leaving big clouds of fur behind, so I'm sure that's something I'm going to have to start keeping an eye out for.
Yeah, that's right. Sounds good. Now, you said you work full-time?
Yes.
Okay. When do you think you'll be able to use your inhaler?
Well, I plan on using it in the morning when I get ready for work, and then I'll plan on taking that second dosage when I get home from work in the evening.
That's perfect. That's exactly what the doctor has written in your instructions here on your after visit summary. And also on this after visit summary, you can find the steps that we went through on how to use your inhaler.
Okay. No, this will help, because I know when I leave here I'll probably forget half of it, and I know when I tell my family I'm going to have to start using an inhaler, they're going to be asking, well, how often are you using it? And
Sure.
I'll be able to show them this and let them know exactly what I need to do.
That's a great idea, to have this and this packet out and available for you or your family to grab if you need to. That's great. Now, before we leave, would you show me how to use your inhaler?
Sure.
Looks like you got it. Now, feel free, if you think of any questions, definitely call the clinic.
Sure. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. So in that interaction, I hope I really like that interaction, because one of the things that some of the literature on teachback has shown in some of the social validity data is that really the skills of the implementer doing the teachback are what make it effective. If the implementer, of course, there's the element of describing it well and recasting and reframing what you're saying if they don't understand. But the other piece is to ensure that it's not a condescending kind of interaction, that it's really natural. And so one of the things I like about both TAPS and Teachback are that if you introduce them in training, both in your onboarding and in professional development events, that they're things that just become part of the culture of the organization. That when new protocols are implemented, when crisis situations happen, we do things like TAPS and Teachback, and they're just part of the daily practice of supervision. And it gives supervisors a mechanism to not do things like walking around the clinic to just check if everybody's okay, but not have a meaningful interaction with them, or asking something like, providing a bunch of information and then saying, do you understand? Does that work for you? Okay. When you ask that question, hopefully you get a no if they really don't understand, but you might not get anything at all. And you have no idea whether or not they understand. So doing teachback, doing TAPS are ways of making things that are covert overt, so that you can respond to them and then you can continuously improve. And sometimes when supervisors have been looking at ways, they said, oh gosh, I wish I got more feedback from technicians to understand how I could be a better supervisor or what I could be doing differently. Well, sometimes they don't have any of that information, because in that kind of information they're collecting happens after a long period of time, like after a month or after a 3-month or 6-month kind of culture check. And instead of in the moment saying, I'm going to figure out in this moment if these contingencies are working for us right now. So some of the other ideas around where to use teachbacks are things like, and these aren't all tech related, but teaching a caregiver to run a bedtime routine where you're not going to actually be there, or BST might not exactly make sense. Coaching families in the steps of a toilet training protocol, having your staff review a new update to a behavior intervention plan, spotting what are the differences in the plan, preparing people to go out and do a community outing. Which takes us to our third tactic, which is debriefing. And debriefing, again, is a practice that was popularized in healthcare, mainly in nursing. And it was something that has often followed simulation, or real patient interactions, especially with trainees. And it's often referred to as where the learning happens, because it's the place where you get your staff to engage in, or your trainees to engage in reflection on their action, and they have an opportunity to unpack that experience. There are many different forms of debriefing, but the general framework is that there's a skilled facilitator, and not always is it the person that's leading the team. Like if you've got a behavior analyst and 3 techs, not always does the debrief need to be the behavior analyst. You could bring in an outside facilitator to facilitate the session, just like you would bring in like a conflict mediator to a situation. You have a skilled facilitator who knows how to use debriefing practices. And this could be something that happens after a crisis situation. It could be day-to-day situations. It could be a simulation, whatever you think warrants review. And even though there are a lot of different frameworks around it, it's got the same basic components. The first piece being that we establish psychological safety, meaning that everybody that's participating in this debrief, this is a shared space where we've all got different perspectives of what happened. Let's say in a crisis situation, we've all got different perspectives around what happened. Everybody has different bits of information they're going to share, and no one should feel like they can't participate. And part of the role of the skilled debriefer is facilitating the conversation in a way that it allows different perspectives to be brought to the surface. Then you gather reactions, which is often a missing component. And this is one of the things that I've been talking about and working on with some colleagues that work in complex or severe behavior settings is that often when we do debriefs, we might only gather the facts of what happened, like basically having a dialogue that gets the information you would need to put in an incident report. Rather than saying, oh my gosh, you just watched this client engage in high rate, high intensity aggression. How do you feel about that? How are you responding to it? You must be shaken by it. Even people who've seen it, 1,000 times, they may have an emotional response to it. And sometimes that can get glossed over. We immediately go to the facts analysis and then solving a problem rather than responding to the technician's psychological safety. And I just saw at the ABAI Portugal conference last week, saw a great talk. I'm not going to be able to think of the presenter's name at the moment. But a great talk that was on severe behavior where they have created a modified version of adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. They've created a version of that for staff that work in severe behavior settings. And they have these regular pulse checks where it asks them questions like, in the last month, have you observed a client do X or Y? To realize that adults in working in these settings are going to be contacting some very difficult situations where they may, over time, either in that one instance or over time, those collectively are going to have an impact on how they can do in their job, and how they're doing psychologically. And so I think that that's something that is hopefully going to continue in the behavior analytic literature, but is definitely prominent in the psychological safety literature in nursing and medicine. So gathering those reactions and then summarizing the facts, especially if you're not there as the behavior analyst to participate in the event and you didn't directly observe it, different people are going to have different points of view on what happened. And by having a time to gather all those facts and put them in chronological order will give you a good idea of if there are any gaps, and will give you as much information as you can have to conduct a thorough analysis. The analysis portion is where you break down the situation, figure out what happened, what went well, what didn't, what were situational variables that came up, and then summarize with take-home points. Maybe these are things we do differently next time. Maybe these are things we keep doing. Maybe these are protocol modifications we need to make, those kinds of things. In the resources we'll share, I put in one popular framework. It's called the Pearls framework, and it provides guidance for the facilitator on how to structure that conversation, as well as what areas to focus on. When you're doing that analysis, there are different performance domains that you might talk about, like how did the team work well together? What resources did they have or did they use or did they need? What decisions were made? How did leadership respond? All of those are different angles of situations that you might encounter. And after you conduct a professional development event and you have people go and implement whatever you taught in practice, this can be a really great way for you to see how it was applied and give you a sense of whether or not there's further refinement, additional training, and so on that's needed. All right. In those materials, I'm also going to include a couple videos to some debriefs. There are many of these that are online, but we won't watch this because of time. But here are some situations where you might find debriefing helpful. Of course, crisis or high intensity situations that may happen, even after a successful session, or you've implemented a new protocol, or there have been a lot of changes for this client. Maybe the client has struggles with feeding or sleep, and so you want to address those. And you want to address a new protocol in relation to those issues. Maybe there's been some conflict with staff or miscommunication, or there's a caregiver meeting and there need to be changes in treatment as a result of that meeting. Those are all good opportunities to conduct a debrief. And debriefs, even though as you'll see in some of the videos, can be longer. They can be 30 minutes or an hour. These are also things that can be very short. They can be the types of questions you ask, things that you probe for right on the job. And that's one of the things that some of the people who've developed different frameworks have found, that models, different ways of debriefing are appropriate for experts, a team of really skilled clinicians that are working together, they still need debriefing, but it looks different from debriefing with novices that are working on the case or maybe early career professionals. So there are different frameworks out there that are more or less helpful for those different audiences and those different types of situations. So as we come to the close of our time together today, again, we center on this framework that the events that we create should have multiple touch points, both in terms of practice, reinforcement, refinement, and supervision meetings in practice. And there are techniques that we can use to really strengthen that. We can do things like have talk aloud episodes. We can do, teach back, either when it's a skill that they learned in the PDU or something they're doing on the job. And then we can also implement debriefs. And all three of those, either separately and together, can be very helpful for strengthening anything that we want people to be able to know and do. Check out that ABA compliance podcast and reach out to us if you have interest in learning more about our 40-hour RBT training, our ProTech product, or any of our learning and performance supports that we provide to organizations of all sizes. So thanks so much for being with us.